Welcome everyone to today's webcast. Today we'll be talking about minimizing the business impact of the PCI 3.0 transition. I'm Sally Sheward. I do marketing for Truvantis. And our speaker today is Andy Cottrell, who is the CEO and founder of Truvantis. He has over 25 years designing, implementing, and managing IT security for businesses. He has deep knowledge of security technology and testing and how to implement solutions that work in the real world. Today, Andy will be providing an overview of changes to PCI DSS requirements for 3.0 and discussing ways to minimize the impact on your business. Now, I have just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The first one is that we are recording the webcast, and we will send out a link as soon as it's available. You should feel free to share that with others. And if you have questions during the presentation, please put them in the Q&A window in WebEx, and Andy will answer them at the end. If you have additional questions after the webcast is over, please feel free to send them to info@truvantis.com. Now, with that, let's get started. I'll go ahead and hand this over to Andy.
Great. Thanks very much, Sally. So what we're looking through today is just very briefly why it is that we have a new standard, a new version of the standard, and how that refresh cycle works. A couple of notes on a general overview of what is changing, and then we'll walk through the specifics of a few significant changes. Certainly the items in requirements 1 to 12 of the standard, but there's also a lot of preamble to the PCI DSS standard. We sometimes jokingly refer to it as requirement 0, all the stuff that comes before the detailed requirements. And there's a lot of interesting changes in there, which we'll mention. There's also a bit of a reorganization to the PCI documents, so we'll talk about that. And then after a few final notes, we'll look at some questions. So the PCI DSS standard is refreshed every 3 years, and it goes through this very disciplined process of issuing it, and then there's a time frame to look at it, and then you have to implement it and comply with it. And once it's up and running and people have been working with it, they get some feedback, and then they go through a cycle of revising it again, so that you get a new version of the standard updated every 3 years. So the date that we're looking at next is January the 1st, coming up in a few days, really. And that will be the point at which 3.0 becomes active. The standard is already available, so you can download it from the payment card industry website, and we'll give you details on how to get that later. But January the 1st, you will be allowed to comply with it, and you will be allowed to validate against it. Later on, at the end of the year, it then becomes mandatory. At that point, you must be complying with the 3.0 standard, and you must be validating with it after that point. So for the whole of next year, you have the choice. Do you want to comply and validate with the 2.0 or the 3.0? And it's entirely up to you and your business choices as to when you want to make that transition. In general terms, there's been a great deal of clarification. So a lot of the changes from 2.0 to 3.0 don't actually change what they want you to do. They're just clarifying it to make sure that you understand. Some of this is because it wasn't particularly clear and it deserved clarification. Some of it is because people were bringing language lawyers to argue about whether the comma before or after system meant that they were actually required to do something. So they're trying to make it so that the intent is much clearer. And frankly, if you are taking that approach where you're reading the language and you're trying to work out exactly what is it making me do, then you're kind of missing the point. Really, you need to understand the intent of what they're trying to do. There's a lot of discussion and information about the intent behind the requirements, and we'll give you some insight into where to find that. Really, you need to understand what they're trying to achieve and use it to help you make smart risk decisions, rather than trying to negotiate every comma and piece of punctuation to understand exactly what you are required to do and see if you can argue that you don't need to do something because the sentence doesn't phrase it that way. There are some additional requirements and things that we haven't seen before, and we'll walk through the most significant ones of those. This whole requirement 0, that narrative before you get to the numbered requirements, that's actually been quite overhauled and is much more useful now. The documents have been reorganized in a way that makes them easier to use. And another standout change is that in many places, they are focusing on the goals of a technology rather than the specific name of a technology. So where it says you have to have a firewall, now it says you have to have something that does firewall-like things, rather than requiring stuff that was considered to be a product, really, like intrusion prevention, intrusion detection, file integrity monitoring, web application firewalls. The standard in version 2 sounded like you had to go and buy a product or a service that had that label on it. Now they've made it clear that what they want is these behaviors. And if you can find it as a feature of something that you've already got, and after looking at the behavior of it, you think that that's sufficient, then you can just use that. If you can build the technology yourself using some scripts or some other something out of your bag of tricks that you can use to implement these functions, then that's good enough. So they've made it clear that you don't have to buy these products, you just have to have these functions in place. So today, going through, we're going to look at some of the more significant changes. So in this requirement 0 section, one of the first things it talks about is scope. And scope is always a big issue with PCI compliance and with validation. What's in and what's out. And there's quite a lot of discussion, enhanced discussion in the 3.0 version about the scope. One specific thing they did clarify is that sensitive authentication data cannot be stored after authorization, even if the primary account number is not there. So cardholder account data, that's all the information that's on a credit card, whether it's on the mag stripe or embossed on the front, is split into 2 types. There's what the PCI standard calls cardholder data, so that's your primary account number, the PAN, the cardholder name, the expiration date. There's something called the service code that you'll find inside the track data on the magnetic strip. That's the cardholder data. The other half is the sensitive authentication data, and that is the full binary details off of the magnetic stripe or in the chip, the CVC, that's the 3 or 4 digit code on the front or the back, or the PIN number or the PIN block. So that's the sensitive data. And you've always been told that in 2.0 that you cannot store the sensitive authentication data after you have authorized the transaction. People were saying, that's okay, we don't store the primary account number with it, so it doesn't matter. So they're now clarifying that no, even if the primary account number is not present, you still can't store this track data, the CVC code, or the PIN number. They've also clarified something that was still true in 2.0, but again, they've got much more language around reinforcing this time. The deciding of what is your scope for the cardholder data environment, your CDE, that's your responsibility. So if you use an external auditor, a QSA like Truvantis, to come in and do your annual audit, it's not the auditor that comes in and decides what is the scope of your environment. It's you. You decide what is the scope of your environment. And then you tell your auditor, and the auditor will validate the process that you went through to make that determination, and will help make sure that you got it right. But you have to maintain a statement of this is our cardholder data environment. And you should do that. You should review that annually before your validation, whether it's with an auditor or you're doing it internally yourself for an SAP. And you should do it after any significant change. Segmentation is therefore the next big issue, because you want to try and reduce your scope as much as possible. And there's a lot of language added into this preamble to the standards to help you understand segmentation and the choices. And in fact, there's now a flow chart at the end of the standard to help you decide whether the segmentation is working or not. But as a basic principle, I like to say these 2 things. Firstly, if you're using a control to de-scope the environment, so for example, you're using a firewall to separate the in-scope from the out-of-scope, then that control is in scope. So if you have a firewall to separate the 2, then the firewall is in scope. If you're separating traffic using VLANs, then the technology that creates those VLANs, that's in scope. So any control that you use to separate the in-scope parts from the out-of-scope parts, the control itself, be it the firewall or the switch, that then becomes in scope. And if you think a system is out of scope, then it needs to be true that for an attacker, if an attacker compromised that system that you consider out of scope, that would not help them in attacking the cardholder data environment. And this comes into play often when people have a firewall to separate their in-scope from their out-of-scope servers and their Windows systems, and they're all on the same domain, and the domain credentials are used to authenticate for both the in-scope and the out-of-scope environment. So in that scenario, the domain controller, if it were compromised, that would impact the security of the cardholder data environment, so you would have to consider the domain controller to be in scope. Another section in requirement in the preamble, which we give this nickname of requirement 0. So in all this text before, it talks about wireless. There's much more text there about wireless than there has been before. Basically, the PCI doesn't like wireless, and they really want to avoid wireless being in or connected to your cardholder data environment. Sometimes it's unavoidable, and it is possible to set this up correctly, make it secure, and minimize the risk associated with having wireless connections in or connected to your cardholder data environment. But basically, the standard is really trying to deter you from doing that. And I think the motivation here is that they spend a lot of time analyzing breaches and then trying to modify the standard and give guidance to help people avoid the mistakes that have led to breaches. And a lot of security breaches that have compromised cardholder data, the attackers got in through wireless. So you can do it, but the standard is really trying to persuade you to see if you can segment your architecture and segment your infrastructure so that the wireless section is on the outside of the cardholder data environment, and therefore a compromise of your wireless connection would not be a compromise of the cardholder data environment. Again, more language around working with service providers, and the relationship between you and your service provider is elaborated on a lot more than in the version 2.0. It's not really a change in the intent or the meaning. It's just a clarification to make it very clear that your cardholder data environment is your responsibility, and you have to make sure that the whole environment is compliant. And if you outsource anything to a service provider, maybe they're dealing with your backup tapes, maybe they're processing some transactions for you, maybe they're providing a data center for you to host your servers at, anywhere where you are relying on others in a way that would enable them to put your cardholder data at risk, it's your job to make sure that they are compliant. Now, if they've had their own audit, if you've gone to a data center because they are PCI compliant, they are PCI validated, they have an attestation of compliance certificate to say that, that's great, but that doesn't change the fact that this is still your responsibility to make sure that they are compliant. But it is a useful tool to help you determine whether they are compliant. And there's some new language in the 3.0 standard which is talking about the fact that you have to make sure that your service providers are compliant. And one of the ways that you can do that is to get an attestation of compliance certificate and perhaps look at the relevant sections of the service provider's report on compliance, which could be redacted if there's anything sensitive in there. That could be part of the procedure that you go through to make sure that your service provider is compliant. You cannot just say, they're certified, I don't have to worry about it. It's still your responsibility. That hasn't changed, but it's been spelled out in great detail in 3.0. There is a whole new section in the preamble to 3.0 about business as usual behavior. Completely new section, and it discusses how to build compliance with the standard into your daily routine. And there's nothing in there which is a new requirement, so you don't have to go through and check off whether you're complying with this new language. It's just guidance and advice to help you think about where you need to integrate the things that PCI makes you do into your daily routine. And a lot of the discussion and press from the PCI Security Council has started using this language of business as usual behavior. I was at the PCI community meeting recently, and the phrase turned up in almost every presentation that they gave, talking about business as usual behavior. And I think what they're trying to do here is say that PCI is not something that you do once a year. You can't just dust it off once a year, do your validation, bring in the auditor, do your self-assessment questionnaire, whatever it is that you're going to do for validation, and then forget about it for a year. It has to be something that you live and breathe throughout the whole year, and it needs to change and guide your business as usual behaviors. So moving into some of the more detailed requirements in sections 1 to 12. So there's some stuff on policy and procedure. A lot of this was collected into section 12, requirement 12. they've moved some of that out into the relevant place in the standard. So items that were to do with firewall policies are now with the firewall rules, the same with routers, stuff with router policies with the router requirements. So you may think that Section 12 has got smaller and that there's less to do there to do with policies and operational procedures. I'm sorry, it's still there. They just moved it into a more sensible place. But they have added some more, and there's now a requirement in Section 12 for you to maintain an inventory of system components and the function or use of those components. And that's something you need to maintain. Again, it's not an annual event. It's part of your business's usual behavior, is to have an up-to-date inventory of everything which is within your cardholder data environment. Now, to be honest, you probably did this anyway, certainly for your once-a-year validation. You probably made a list of all the stuff that's in scope so that you could talk about hardening and patching and things like that. So you're doing it anyway. All I would suggest now is just leave an audit trail to show that you have reviewed it and you're keeping it current. And if you use a ticket system, which a lot of people do to collect their PCI evidence, just open a ticket, update the inventory, attach it to the ticket, close the ticket to say that you've reviewed it and it's current. They want you to keep this inventory up to date annually, and after any significant change, I would suggest that you create a regular task to just go in and make sure that nothing has changed. I'm a great believer in having automation to remind you to do things. There's a lot of things which are quarterly or annually or semi-annually that have to be done. It's just a timer goes off, you need to do it. So if you can train your ticket system or some other alerting mechanism you have to just throw up an alert, create a task for someone and say, it's time for the semi-annual review of the firewalls, it's time for the quarterly review of the inventory, then that puts it in front of you so that you don't forget to address it. So I would just suggest that you add a task to verify that your inventory is up to date to your automated ticket system. Small change on passwords. They still say that it has to be at least 7 characters and alphanumeric for your passwords, but there's now a provision that you can use an equivalent strength if that's not going to work for you. And I think this is to recognize that there are certain obscure or legacy systems which won't allow 7-character passwords or won't allow numbers in the password. So if you meet one of those scenarios, you can now use something of equivalent strength. And you can just do the math. If you work out how many possible passwords there could be, making out of 7 characters using the alphabet and the numbers, that tells you how many possible passwords there can be. If you need a different scheme, just come up with something which has the same or more possible passwords, and you'll be fine, you'll be compliant. To be honest, this is quite a low bar. If a penetration tester or an attacker can steal a hash of the password, and when I'm doing penetration tests, that happens all the time. I get hold of either I see it on the wire because the protocol discloses it, or we find it on a system in a password file. It's not unusual to find the hashes of the password. And with modern computing power, it doesn't take that long to try every possible password to see whether that's the one that generated the hash. And then if you find a match, then you know you've got the password. And 7 characters alphanumeric, frankly, with modern computing power, you can do that in a day or so. So really, passwords need to be more complicated. They need to be mixed case. They need to have special characters. They need to have more than 7 characters. PCI always claims that it is a minimum standard, and you should set the standards above and beyond PCI that are appropriate for your environment. And this is one place that stands out to me as a place where you should do better. Malware, bit of clarification here. There's a requirement in 2.0 to deploy antivirus systems on, and they say, systems commonly affected by malicious software. And everyone interprets that to just mean basically Windows. They've now expanded that and say you need to periodically evaluate all those other systems to see if it's time to add antivirus on other systems as well, based on the evolving threat landscape and what malware is out there. And this is basically recognizing that it's no longer just Windows that has malware that's being distributed. And also, this is a standard that we're going to have to live with for the next 3 years. So who knows what's going to happen to malware over the next 3 years. So it's now your responsibility to decide routinely, it just says periodic evaluations, to decide whether you need to deploy antivirus on more systems because malware is evolving that might attack them. And again, the important thing here really is to leave an audit trail. So you need to decide what your period is. You might decide semi-annually or annually, but create some kind of record to show that you've looked around, you've assessed the landscape of malware, you've looked at what the antivirus vendors are saying, and you've decided whether or not you need antivirus on other systems beyond the ones that you already have it on. Risk ranking of vulnerabilities and patching. So this is the whole 6.1, 6.2 area from the 2.0 standard. This has always been a little bit messy and confusing about exactly which pieces are required where and when. So this has been, the 6.1 and 6.2 have kind of been coordinated together, and it's been made clear that basically the issue with security patches is that a security patch from a vendor indicates that there's a vulnerability to be patched. So basically, it's all about vulnerabilities and how to handle them. So in version 2.0, they introduced this requirement that you need to risk rank all vulnerabilities that you discover. And the risk ranking needs to be at least which ones are high, and then the rest. And of course, this is the risk to you, the risk to your environment, the risk to cardholder data in your environment. So which vulnerabilities are high and which ones are not high. So that applies, it's been clarified in 3.0, this applies to all vulnerabilities, whether it be indicated by a security patch becoming available, or whether you find it through another route or discussion, or whether it's a vulnerability you discover in your application or your environment, or something to do with the people and process side, wherever. Anywhere you discover a vulnerability, you need to assess the risk to your environment and classify which ones are high risk and which ones aren't. There's a new provision to additionally flag vulnerabilities as being critical. And there's the language there, if they pose an imminent threat to the environment, impact critical systems, or would result in a potential compromise if not addressed. So that's really a separate flag, the way the language is written. You've got to separate your high risk from your not high risk, and then pick out any which are critical, and that might be because of where the vulnerability is found. I think in practice, what people are going to do is say, okay, so now we have three. We've got critical, we've got high, and we've got low. Critical really means it's a high risk and it's a critical threat to the environment. And that all applies to all vulnerabilities, no matter where you find out about them from. Some of those will be because they relate to security patches that you've received from your vendor, from the operating system or some other component or some firmware on a switch or a router or a firewall. The vendor has applied a security patch, and that's how you find out about the vulnerability in the system. Where that applies, if you have decided that this issue is critical, then you need to get that security patch deployed within a month. Anything else that comes from the vendor as a security patch, you need to get it deployed in an appropriate time frame. And they suggest 3 months, but that's up to you. But the whole 1 month, 3 month cycle is something that we're very familiar with from 2.0. But they're making it much more focused on the idea of this determination of risk to your environment. There's some further changes in Section 6. Section 6, I think it's 6.5, starts listing out all the different types of coding vulnerabilities, coding errors that might lead to a vulnerability in a system. And a lot of those are driven by the OWASP top 10 vulnerabilities, because the vast majority of applications that lead to breaches are web applications, and the OWASP organization tracks vulnerabilities which are the most prevalent, and every few years they publish the top 10 vulnerabilities. PCI, therefore, does look to OWASP and shines a light on them as an example of best practice for what to look for and what to make sure you're not vulnerable to. So in following that, OWASP has added some new stuff, particularly around broken authentication and session management. So that, again, is now called out specifically in Section 6.5 of the new version of the standard. And by that, they're talking about making sure that you have the secure flag set on a cookie, not allowing session IDs to be exposed in the URL of a web application, and making sure that timeouts and rotating session IDs after you log in, and all those kind of things, which are well-known issues which are detected in vulnerability assessment. These are now specifically called out And really that's in response to PCI monitoring what OWASP is saying, I think. It's worth noting that OWASP, which is a great resource, has a new top 10 for 2013. So if you've been using the old top 10, you need to go and look at the new one and see what they've changed and why they've changed. And I'd also point out this other site, securecoding.cert, which is from Carnegie Mellon. That has a lot of great detail about really good, strong coding practices in a variety of different languages. And that's worth a deep dive if you're developing applications for your environment, to keep an eye on the coding standards that you're using there. There's a completely new area on card skimmers. This is an evolving threat. We've seen a lot of this in recent years. People putting devices in front of ATMs, in front of gas pumps, the card readers, and stealing the cardholder data as the card is swiped or the PIN number is typed in, those kind of things. So there's a lot of new requirements, or a few new requirements in a section on card skimming. This becomes mandatory after July the 1st, so you've basically got 18 months to get your head around how you want to deal with this. One requirement is for you to know where all of these point of interaction devices are. If you have lots of point of sale terminals or CSRs who are swiping cards, you need to maintain a list. You need to have an inventory of all the places where card swipes or card data enter into your systems because the cardholder passes over their plastic. You need to periodically inspect these devices to make sure that they haven't been tampered with, to make sure that somebody hasn't put a shim over the top of it to capture the data as the card's inserted. And you need to train the personnel who are at the point of sale or at the point of interaction with the piece of plastic to make sure that they are aware of how to detect tampering or replacement of a unit. So that's an expansion, really, I think, of the security awareness training to make sure that people are trained in how to look for this stuff. I talked about wireless briefly at the overview. There's some expanded language in that preamble section before the requirements. But the requirements that relate specifically to wireless have always talked about scanning for rogue devices. This has now been expanded to make sure that you do a good job. People were trying to use their vulnerability scan to just say, I've identified all the IP addresses in my environment and I've made sure I know what they are, and none of them are wireless access points. And that's helpful, sure, but it's not enough because there are many other ways of getting a wireless device or a wireless access point connected into your environment, for example, USB. And many operating systems will just automatically configure and provision a network device if it's inserted. So there are scenarios where even if the servers were caged off, you could push a USB cable on the end of a piece of wood through the chain link fence outside the cage in the data center and push a device into a USB socket and connect to a wireless device that way. And frighteningly enough, these things, although they sound far-fetched, actually do happen. So they are broadening how hard you have to look for rogue devices. And that would then include listening for the radio transmissions with a scanner and also looking inside the operating system to see if there are any unrecognized USB devices or other devices that are connected through and connecting you to a wireless radio. So that is broadened and you have to look a little harder there. And the thing here is really to, again, focus on the intent of what they're trying to do. Don't look at the language to see if you have covered everything that they specifically ask you to do. Focus on the intent, which is to make sure that there's no chance that you have a wireless device in your environment. And you need to think about your environment and work out what tests and what scans you will need to do in order to make sure that that is true. Vulnerability scans, they've made something a little easier here, which is nice. It has been hard, particularly in large environments. You would do your vulnerability scan, you would find some issues that have arisen, and therefore you'd go and do your remediation. And then PCI 2.0 would require that you do a retest in order to make sure that you have fixed the things that you just repaired. And the problem is, in a large environment, you will probably find that there are new alerts which are giving you a new failing scan. So you go off to remediate those, and during that time, the vulnerability scanner would be updated, it would detect newer issues, and you would always be getting a failing scan. So what they've said now is you can combine multiple scans to get a passing grade. So if you do a vulnerability scan and it has a few broken items on it, then if you do a new scan to show that those are fixed, then you have passed your quarterly scan requirement, even if that scan then threw up new items that weren't in the first scan. What you would then do is say, okay, I've met my quarterly scanning requirement, but this is a new source of vulnerability information, and you'd throw them into your 6.1, 6.2 behavior of doing a risk ranking and deciding how you're going to address it and when you're going to address it, but you'd need to get that done certainly by the time you come around for your next quarterly vulnerability scan. Penetration testing, this has been greatly expanded, both in the detail of how they want you to do it and also in what you need to test. It's quite a significant change, so again, this is a recommended best practice for 18 months, and in the middle of 2015, that's when it becomes mandatory. It's always required internal and external testing of network and applications. What they're now adding, or one of the main things they're adding, is testing of the descoping controls. So if you have a data center which is segmented between your in-scope and your out-of-scope components, and they're separated by a firewall, then that would mean you've got three perspectives to test. You've got your external test, which is coming in over the internet. You've got your internal penetration test, which is testing from within the in-scope environment. But now you have to test from the out-of-scope internal environment to see if you can penetrate into your in-scope internal environment. So wherever you have segmentation now, you have to do penetration testing to validate the segmentation. The penetration test also needs to review the last 12 months threats and vulnerabilities that were discovered in the environment and take those into consideration in order to guide the penetration test. The difference between penetration testing and a vulnerability assessment is basically the human driving it. A vulnerability assessment is very automated, it's tool-driven. Penetration tests are very human affairs. It's a skilled expert trying to break in, and sure, using a lot of automated tools to help them, but it's the application of operator cunning, if you like, that turns it into a penetration test. So this review of the last 12 months information on the threats and vulnerabilities that were detected in your environment, which you should be tracking and recording anyway for other requirements, this is information that should be fed to the penetration tester to help them steer and guide their efforts. And it also calls out that the type, depth, and complexity of the testing will depend on the specific environment and the organization's risk assessment. So you can help guide how big or small the penetration test should be based on the environment you have. A lot of people would say, my environment is too small, I've just got this one machine which is a point of sale and it's got a direct connection to the internet and we're doing an SAQC or CBT. It's very small. We don't need to do penetration tests because it's not listed in the SAQ. Well, actually, just because it's not in the SAQ doesn't mean you don't have to do it. The SAQ limits the amount of validation you have to do, not the amount of compliance you have to do. You always have to comply with the whole standard, and that would always include penetration testing. But what it's saying here is you can choose how much penetration testing. If you've got a really small, relatively low-risk environment, the penetration test could also be relatively small. So a couple of tips there. One is don't be sold a vulnerability assessment as a pen test. There's a lot of providers out there who will say we can do your PCI pen test, but all they do is just point a tool at your environment, run the tool, print out the report, and send it to you. That's not a pen test because there was very little human value added. That's a vulnerability assessment. So be wary of those. And you should also make sure that your penetration tester is on a roadmap to transition to the new rules by the 18-month deadline. Risk assessments. So firstly, the requirement for risk assessments has changed slightly. It always asked you to do your risk assessment annually, at least annually, but now they've added after any significant change. The other thing is that they've now started using the phrase your risk assessment throughout the entire standard. So there are many other requirements where they've done the clarification and they've made it less black and white and put much more the onus on you to decide how much risk is in your environment, how much a particular requirement impacts the reduction of risk, so that you can guide and steer the way that you comply with the standard. So the word risk assessment is now distributed throughout the standard, whereas before it was just that one section in section 12, one or two policy item numbers which said you have to do a risk assessment. Now it says in many places, do this after doing a risk assessment to work out how hard you should do it and how you should do it. And that's really helpful because that helps you guide your risk assessment. If you're trying to work out what should your risk assessment look like, one of the things that you can do is just go through the standard, version 3.0, search for the phrase risk assessment, and use that to guide what it is that you do and how you write it up. Incident response was always there in 2.0. You had to have an incident response plan. You had to rehearse it. You had to train people. They've expanded the language around the incident response section to say that you're not just planning for a major breach where you throw a flag on play and say, this is an incident, we're going into incident response mode, we're going to call the CEO and the lawyers and tell everybody there's this big incident and put an incident commander in place. Okay, that would still apply for a major breach, sure, but they want your incident response plan to discuss all sizes of incidents. So if you start getting alerts from a firewall or some other monitoring system to say, you know, there's something odd going on over there, they want your incident response plan to describe what it is that your behavior will be in response to small details coming in from your monitoring system. So you've got a larger mandate here to choose what it is that you're going to monitor, where the alerts should come from, what it is that you're going to respond to. But they want you to consider the entire range of incidents, from just somebody scanning my firewall all the way through to somebody's just run away with a few million credit card numbers. So it's not just the big breaches anymore, it's the whole range. And again, the clue here is focus on the intent of what they're trying to do, not the exact sentences and the language that they've chosen to put into the standard. They're trying to get you to think ahead so that you can decide in advance what would you do if this happens. And then you've got a playbook, and you're not trying to make it up as you go along when you see something strange happen. They have reorganized the documents somewhat. So the 2.0 standard, after all that preamble language, a lot of which was relating to how a QSA should do an audit and how a QSA should write their report on compliance. So all of that stuff, which is instructions to the QSA, that's all gone from the document. And when you get into the requirements 1 to 12 section, in 2.0, it said, this is the requirement, this is how you test to see if you've complied with the requirement, and then here is where you fill in whether it's in place or not in place, or you add notes. And so really it was a document to be used by a QSA as a report on compliance, as well as a statement as to what the standard is. So they've changed that in 3.0. The 3.0 standard is all about the intent of what you should comply with. It's the requirements, and it's nothing in there about how to be a QSA and how to do an audit and how to report on an audit. That's all been moved into a separate document for QSAs or internal auditors doing a report on compliance. There used to be, in 2.0, a separate document, which was very valuable, called Navigating the PCI DSS Requirements. And that had all the information about what they meant when they said something in the standard. And it was very valuable, and people often didn't go there and look at it. So they've moved that into the standard. So the standard now tells you what you should do and what they meant when they wrote it and why it's important. And all the stuff to do with reporting has been moved out. This is a great move forward. It puts all the information that you need in order to drive your compliance program into this one document. So that's great. The self-assessment questionnaires, if you've got less than a few million transactions or 1 million or 2 transactions a year, you might be doing your own self-assessment The self-assessment questionnaires will be updated. You can start filling them out as of January the 1st, although they've not been released yet. We haven't seen them. The QSAs have seen some drafts and some changes, and we know there's a couple of things coming that are interesting. One is that you will be able to submit multiple FAQs, and that sounds like a pain, but it's actually an opportunity. In choosing which self-assessment questionnaire you fill out, you have to go through this this decision graph, and in the SAQ document there was a flowchart that it asked you questions to decide, can I just do an SAQ-A because it's really small, or can I just do a B because that one's not so bad, or just do a CVT because all we've got is a virtual terminal. And if you could not answer the questions to perfectly map one of these smaller SAQs to your environment, you got lumped into SAQ-D, which basically means you have to answer all 300 questions and fill out a complete self-assessment questionnaire for every requirement in PCI. What they're saying now, or what we expect them to say when they release it, is that if you've got a virtual terminal over here and then just a web application over there, then you can fill out just the 2 SAQs that would cover those 2 scenarios in your environment, and you don't have to get lumped into SAQ-D and do everything. So that's an opportunity to reduce the amount of validation that you do by filling out multiple smaller SAQs rather than having to fill out the big SAQ-D. There's also going to be a couple of new SAQs, we're told, one of which will relate to hosted payment pages. So there's been a bit of a loophole that people have exploited here in the past, in that if you didn't want to accept credit card data on your website, you could outsource the pages that accept the cardholder data to a third-party provider, your acquirer or gateway or some other vendor who is PCI compliant and PCI validated. And quite often in the better systems, they will put your branding on their pages so that your users don't know necessarily that they've left your web server and have now reached the payment gateway's web server and they're entering the transaction there. And you would just have a link during the checkout. You collect all the information you want about what the user's trying to buy or why they're giving you money, and then you would forward them, redirect them over to the gateway or the acquirer to collect the credit card information. And that's a great way of keeping the credit card information off of your servers. And that was used as a de-scoping control to say, look, I don't have the card data, I never touch it, it's my payment gateway over there, they're hosting the page that takes all the data, so it's their problem, it's in their PCI audit, it's not in mine. And that's still kind of true, but there's going to be this new SAQ that recognizes that you still have some risk here. You still have control over your web server, which is where the redirect to the page that collects the payment data comes from. So if an attacker were to break into your website, although you do not have the cardholder data there, the attacker could change your website so that the redirect goes to the attacker, and then the attacker can collect the credit card data on his website instead of going to the gateway. So you still have some risk here. So we are told there's going to be a new SAQ to cover that scenario, to tell you what kind of controls you should have in place on a web server that forwards your users to a hosted payment page, even if you don't host the payment pages yourself. So before we go over to questions, a couple of last thoughts. One is download and have a look at the summary of changes document. So if you go to the PCI website, you'll see the 2.0 version and the 3.0 version of the PCI DSS standard. There's also a document that tells you what's changed between 2.0 and 3.0. And that's the first place I would go. And I'd suggest you do that now. Do that pretty soon. Get the changes document and go through every item and see how it's going to impact you. And sure, comply with the language of what they're saying, but focus on the intent and use your risk assessment to make the requirement make sense in your environment. Don't go crazy jumping through hoops to comply with every last comma and period in the requirement. Focus on what they're trying to achieve. The intent of the requirement is now described in that extra column they've added in there, and use that to work out what changes you're going to have to make. And go through your risk assessment as part of that exercise and upgrade your risk assessment for 3.0 because, again, by understanding your risk in your environment, you can scale your behavior appropriately, and sometimes that means scale it down and do a smaller response than perhaps would be implied by just reading the standard on its own. So that's a quick look at the major items that are changing as we go towards 3.0, and we will now stop for questions. So if you have any questions, please enter them into the question and answer box on the WebEx. So we've got one question there that is asking, do we have any tips for creating complicated passwords that people can remember? So that's always a challenge. To be a good password, it has to be something which is so complicated you can't remember it, but you're also not allowed to write it down. So there's two approaches, really. One is to use a password manager so that you don't have to remember it. You can use something like RoboForm or LastPass. There are several out there, and they will store all the passwords encrypted so that you then only have to remember the one password for that system, and you can have that protect all the passwords that you're using on other systems, because of course you don't want to use the same password in more than one place. So that's one tip. But if you are trying to create something that needs to be complicated, but you need to be able to remember it, then don't use what I call kiddie script. Kiddie script is where you think of a sentence and then you change some of the characters. You make the F into a 3, you make the I into a 1. Don't do those because they're predictable. And when we're using our password hash cracking machines, we know all of those tricks. And therefore, you are not greatly randomizing anything by making those minor changes. The best way to make a memorable password, which is sufficiently complex, is to think up a sentence that means something to you. My dog likes to chase sticks, or something like that. And then take the first letter from each word in the sentence and factor that into the password. Throw in some punctuation as part of the sentence and choose which ones are going to be capitals and which ones aren't. Maybe you say, my dog Spot likes to chase sticks, and then you make the name Spot because it's a name, you make it a capital, those kind of things. That's the best way to create a password which is going to be complicated and you can remember it. I'm being asked if the presentation is going to be downloadable. I'm not sure, quite possibly. I know that we are releasing a recording of it, so we'll be able to see the recording. I'll try and see if we can get the presentation posted somewhere as well, and we will announce that as a follow-up email out to everybody that attended. Another question, are there any relations with PCI 3.0 and EMV? Not in 3.0 specifically. EMV is not really mentioned in there. It does talk about the equivalence between card data stored in a chip and card data stored on a track. People don't realize necessarily that with EMV, quite often, the card data that was on the magnetic stripe is quite easily readable out of the chip without any great security hurdles to jump over. That's there for legacy compatibility. So EMV gives you some capabilities beyond what you had before, but the existing risks are still there. So really in 3.0, it only talks about how the same things that apply to the mag stripe still apply if you're using a chip with chip and pin or EMV. But it doesn't specifically give you any new requirements or ways to behave in according with EMV. And I think it's unlikely to. What you're more likely to get is guidance from the card brands. Visa Europe specifically has said that if people are moving towards EMV, they may greatly reduce the validation burden that they have to go through. So those kind of mandates are going to come to you through your acquirer or your bank if you're a merchant, or direct from the card brand if you're a service provider. Those will come through as specific brand mandates from Visa, MasterCard, and so forth. They are unlikely to make it into the standard. What else have we got? Someone's asking about risk ranking of security patches. Can they just use the vendor ranking? Right, so when the vendor releases a security patch, they often say, this is a critical patch, this is not a critical patch. And you can use that as guidance, but you can't really use it as the answer. It's your responsibility to risk rank the vulnerability you've discovered for your environment. And that makes sense. If you think that perhaps if you have two vendor release security patches, one is flagged as critical and it applies to your ticketing system if that's in scope, and another is ranked as high, but it applies to where you've got your web application firewall. Well, for you, the second one is probably more critical in your environment because it's more important to keep your web application firewall patched at the front than it is to worry about your ticketing system. So you really need to take that ranking from the vendors as input, and it's useful, but you need to decide for your environment what is a high-risk vulnerability and which are the critical patches and critical vulnerabilities to remediate. The same goes with the information that comes through from vulnerability scanners like Nessus or Qualys. It's good guidance. You need to then leverage that and put it into your environment. Okay, another question there about card skimming. Does it apply to PC keyboards? Great question. In fact, I was talking about this with a customer just a couple of weeks ago. So you've got customer service representatives in a call center typing in card numbers into the keyboard. Does the skimming apply there, the skimming requirements? If people put dongles in line with the keyboard and things like that, are those covered by the new requirements? Standard actually specifically mentions that, and it says that it doesn't, but you should consider it as a best practice. So they'd like you to consider the PC keyboards to be in scope, but it's not actually required. Any more questions there? When will Truvantis be using the new rules for penetration testing? I suspect that's from someone inside the company. But yes, we'll be switching over to the new rules in January. We've already started drafting out the report templates and the questionnaires and so forth so that we can switch over to that early in the year next year to use the more modern penetration testing requirements spelled out in 3.0. So if there are any other questions, I think that probably wraps it up. Is there anything else there, Sally?
I don't think so. If you're done with the questions, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today, and to say that as a thank you for coming to the webcast, we're offering you a free 1-hour phone call consultation on transitioning to 3.0. And to take advantage of that, all you have to do is call or email us and set up a time. You can use the 855 number or info@truvantis.com or the 415 number. Any of that is fine. But just as a thank you for joining us today. And so I think that's it. And everybody have a great holiday season. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot. Bye.